All right, so this is the notes over Judaism. As far as religion goes, when we talk about religions in this class, I mentioned this in class as well, that, I go over the history and how it developed and stuff like that. And I, of course, go into their beliefs as well. And it's up to you, obviously, what you decide and think and believe as far as what you believe to be um, historical fact or not when it comes to things like the parting of the Red Sea and things of that sort. All right, so Judaism. We're going to start way back to pretty much the very beginning. So you go back to the land of Canaan, and this is the land that the Jews believe that is promised to them by God. Now, remember the word Hebrews, that's the term we use to apply to Jews, so people that are ethnically Jew. Keep in mind that people can be ethnically Jew or religiously Jewish, but they're two separate things. So someone that's ethnically a Jew, meaning DNA, they are Jewish. They may not be Jewish by religion. They may be Christian. They may be Muslim or whatever else. So they're not necessarily Jewish. So to be Jewish ethnically doesn't mean you're necessarily Jewish religiously. And you can be Jewish religiously, but not ethnically. So there is a difference between the two. All right, and so you go back to Abraham. He was an He's considered the father of the Jewish nation. Also, Christians trace their heritage back through Abraham, through Isaac, along with the Jews, and then Muslims trace their heritage back through Abraham, but they trace their heritage through Ishmael. And I mentioned that whole thing in class as well and how that came about. So the first 5 books in the Bible is the Torah. I mean, technically the whole Old Testament, the Christians will call the Old Testament is the Torah. First 5 books is the Pentateuch. And this is, they were written by Moses. All right, and then, and like I said, so this mentions Abraham. So just remember, Abraham is considered the father of the Jews. So from him, he had Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, one of which was Joseph. We'll mention here in a minute. And then that's where you get your 12 tribes of Israel. So your 12 tribes of Israel come from, through Isaac, going all the way back to Abraham, and that's where the nation of Israel comes from, are those 12 tribes. All right, and then the God of Abraham. So some basic beliefs about God. So his main name is Yahweh, or I am. And this is a very holy name for the Jews, so they will not write this down or even type it out. Even in English, they won't write down God. They'll put G-D because they believe his name is too holy to be written by human hands. And they believe, of course, he's not a physical being, he's a spirit. So they're monotheistic, belief in one God. It's one of the first major monotheistic religions on earth. And then the idea of covenant is going to come up quite a bit in Judaism. We'll also see this in Christianity. So a covenant is a mutual agreement between God and man, so a promise between the two. And as the Jews see throughout their history, the idea is that God will uphold his end of the bargain, his promise, even if the people fail on their part, because they're going to fail. But God still upholds his promise, even though they will not. And then we get into going back into kind of the history and how they got where they are. You get to Joseph, and Joseph is the one that ends up getting the Jews to Egypt. And so Joseph, if you know the story of him, basically his brothers hated him. They plotted to kill him, ended up throwing him into this pit. He was picked up by a caravan that was going to Egypt, where he was sold into slavery, and they ended up in jail. But he was known as a dream interpreter, and he interpreted some dreams that the Pharaoh was having, basically saying that Egypt was going to be faced with a famine in the coming years. And so the Pharaoh pretty much made Joseph like the vice president of Egypt for the most part, and prepared them for the famine. And so when the famine came, all the land surrounding them was dying pretty much. But Egypt was a storehouse and had tons of food. And so Joseph's family, his brothers that hated and tried to kill him, had to come to him asking for food. And of course, they didn't know it was Joseph. And then he eventually revealed himself. And then the Pharaoh allowed Joseph's family to come into Egypt and seek shelter there, basically, and gave them some land for their herds and stuff like that. So that's how the early Jews, made it into Egypt. So at first they had choice land. There was about 600 of them at that point. Fast forward 400 years, you get to a point to where obviously another Pharaoh is in charge, but several Pharaohs, between Joseph and this point. And the Jews have grown from around 600 to around 1.5 million people. And of course, they worship this other god. And keep in mind, in Egypt, the Pharaoh is a god king. And so you got 1.5 million people They aren't bowing down to you and worshiping you as a god. They may fake it and stuff like that, but still, it's a threat to the Pharaoh. And this is where we're going to start building up to the Exodus. So the Jews, first, this Pharaoh, he pretty much enacts a genocide. So all the children 2 years and under are thrown into the Nile River and killed. And then this is where Moses comes about, where he's put into the Nile and picked up and saved. And then Moses is called back by God to go to his people and to free them. And this is where you get to the Exodus. And so, of course, he asks Pharaoh to free him. He doesn't. And then this is where you get the plagues, like Nile turning to blood, gnats, locusts, boils, hail, darkness, all that kind of stuff. And each plague hits one of the Egyptian gods. So basically saying like, oh, this is a god, well, they can't stop this. Oh, this one's a god, can't stop that either. So like the Pharaoh, for example, is supposed to control the Nile. Well, now it's turned to blood. You're supposed to be able to control the crops. Well, now they've been hailed upon and locusts have eaten them. You're supposed to control the sun rising and shining down on the nation of Egypt. Well, now there's darkness and you can't fix it. So basically it's hitting at the idea that Pharaoh really isn't a god, and neither are any of the gods that Egypt worships. And then you get to the Passover, the last plague, the death of the firstborn, which is retribution for the genocide against the Jewish babies 2 years and younger. And so Passover comes, and this is a very holy day for Jews. Still today they celebrate. Keep in mind, this is like their salvation. This is their gospel, basically. And so this is the most important event in their history. So Passover is where they take the blood of the lamb, put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, and the idea is that the angel of death would pass over them, hence the term Passover, and spare them and save them. And so basically the blood of the lamb saves them. And then after this, Pharaoh allows them to go, and thus begins the Exodus. And then they hightail it out of Egypt. And then, of course, you get the part where, Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues them, and you get the Red Sea crossing, and the Red Sea, of course, crashing down on the Egyptians. And so once they get out of Egypt, now they reach a place called Mount Sinai. And this is where the story goes where, God came down upon the mountain. And then Moses went up to the mountain for about 40 or 50 days on top of the mountain and received the Ten Commandments and other, basic Jewish laws that God had given them. So the first 5 Ten Commandments refer to a relation between God and humanity. The last 5 refer to human relationships, honor your father and mother, things like that. Don't kill people, things of that sort. And so brings the Ten Commandments down. Of course, he finds the people rebelling, worshiping this golden calf, which was an Egyptian god, and then, of course, gets real angry. And then this is where the 40-year journey begins. So it's not that they got lost and journeyed around. Basically, the idea of the punishment for worshiping the golden calf was 40 years in the desert journey until the generation that took part in that sin died off. And so their kids got to enter the promised land, but not them. They had to be punished for that. So eventually they get to Canaan, which is present-day Israel. They arrive there and begin to fight to take the land. Now, the people in the land at this time, these civilizations, were practicing things like human sacrifice. They would sacrifice their children to the gods like Baal and stuff like that. I mean, there's some pretty sick stuff that was being done in that region. So eventually, with the leadership of Joshua, they're able to conquer the land. And then you get into the period of the Judges. And during this time, Israel didn't have a king. And they would eventually fall into sin. So basically the way it would start, kind of like the dynastic cycle in China. People would start good, worshiping God, everything's hunky-dory, and then they would fall into the sin of the people surrounding them. Like, hey, that God's kind of cool, let's worship that one. And then they would start falling into sin, worshiping other gods, creating idols. And then a judge would rise up and say, hey, God saved you from Egypt and brought you out. Now you're worshiping something different. This is wrong. And then the people are like, oh my gosh, you're so right. And then they would ask for forgiveness, make some sacrifices, restore the relationship with God. Everything's going good again. Yay, God. And then, oh, those gods look kind of cool again. And then they would fall back into the sin, worshiping other gods, making idols again. And then another judge would rise up. This happened over and over and over again. But one of the judges was actually a woman, Deborah. So you did see women in Jewish society getting more and more prominence as well. And then you get to Hebrew law. So obviously you had the Ten Commandments. But besides that, you had 681 other laws that came about. Most of these were hygienic. And a lot of these hygienic, especially during the time they were in the desert wandering around, you got a couple million people, you need to have good hygiene. But then other laws, of course, have to do with dietary laws. and stuff like that. When you compare them to laws of other ancient Near East civilizations, these laws were very advanced. A lot more equality, especially between men and women. They had different roles, but both seen as equal in the eyes of God. And then also, too, when it came to like slaves and how they treated slaves, they had to treat slaves as anybody else, as an equal. Basically, had to take care of them, provide for them. It was like every 5 or 7 years, you had the year jubilee, where all the slaves were released and given their freedom. And when slaves did earn their freedom, the master basically had to help them and help them be successful on their own. And so when you compare the Ten Commandments to Hammurabi's Code, for example, Ten Commandments is way more forgiving. So Hammurabi's Code, you steal something, get your hand chopped off. Ten Commandments and the other Jewish laws, you mess up, you go to the priest, you make a sacrifice, you ask God for forgiveness, and you're good, and you go on. And so now, of course, there's, if you kill somebody, you're going to get the death penalty. But just normal everyday sins, you make a sacrifice. All right, and then now we get to the kingdom of Israel. So now we get to our first kings. King Saul is the first king of Israel. It establishes really the kingdom and starts taking over more of the territory. Then King David expands the kingdom even more. David is known for writing the book of Psalms, a lot of the songs in there. And then, of course, he's known for Goliath and all that stuff, and takes out the Philistines. And then you get to Solomon, who's David's son. Solomon is considered the wisest of the kings. He was incredibly wealthy. He also built Solomon's temple, which was absolutely humongous. So the temple is where the presence of God was. And so when they're wandering in the desert, they had a tent basically they took with them. And they would put the Ark of the Covenant, which is this, inside of it. And then Solomon built this, and inside the innermost room is called the Holy of Holies, and this is where they put the Ark of the Covenant. It was believed that God's presence was in that room within this Ark. And also the Ten Commandments was in there, the staff of Moses and stuff like that. So he had that placed in there. Now today we don't know where this is. It actually may be in Ethiopia because when they were getting attacked at one point, it is stated that Solomon sent the Ark of the Covenant down with the Queen of Sheba, which is present-day Ethiopia. But we don't know. If you want to find it, you'll be remembered throughout history for sure, and they'll make a movie about you. So if you want to do that, there's a life goal. All right, so the divided kingdom. Solomon dies, and then Israel's divided between north and south. You got Israel in the north, Judah in the south, two different kings. And of course, the problem with the divided kingdom is that it's going to be easy to take over, especially since Israel's already a small kingdom. So after that, you have the Syrians come in. The Syrians were a brutal empire. They take over, but they don't fully enslave the Jews. Instead, they get tribute from them, which is basically you pay them a lot of money in taxes and crops, and they'll leave you alone. And then the Babylonians take over. Babylonians conquer Assyria, and then they enslave the Jews for 70 years, and then eventually they get the freedom, of course, after 70 years. And then after that, you see about 400 years of not a lot happening, and then Jesus is born, and then we'll get to Christianity later on when we get to the Roman Empire.